You sign it in a parking garage, which should have been the first sign that something was wrong, because normal paperwork happens at desks, under fluorescent lights, with witnesses and printers, and the comforting boredom of routine. This happens on the hood of your car at 9 p.m., with a man named Dorian holding a pen out to you like it's something urgent, something that can't wait until morning. You'd met Dorian 4 days earlier at a conference, the kind where everyone's business card matters more than what they actually do, and he'd approached you specifically, not randomly, the way a man approaches someone he's already decided something about before the conversation starts. He said he represented a private group looking for someone with your exact technical background, someone who understood distributed systems and, more specifically, someone who wasn't currently employed by any company big enough to have a legal department that would ask hard questions about outside consulting. You are, in fact, unemployed at the time, 6 weeks out from a layoff, savings account thinning in that specific way that makes you say yes to things you'd normally sit with for a week. The consulting job pays absurdly well for what he describes as a short-term technical audit. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Reviewing code architecture for a client he won't name yet, for reasons he says will become obvious once you sign the NDA, because the NDA itself is part of what protects you, not just them. You read 3 paragraphs of it under his phone flashlight in the parking garage. It's standard boilerplate mostly, non-disclosure, non-compete. Confidentiality survives termination of the agreement, all things you've signed a dozen times at normal companies for normal jobs. There's one clause that catches your eye, buried in Section 6, that says you agree not to independently investigate the ownership structure, funding sources, or ultimate beneficiaries of the client entity. You ask him what that means in practice. It means you do the technical work, he says. You don't play detective about who's paying for it. That's not because anything illegal is happening. It's because the client values privacy the way some people value oxygen, and curiosity from consultants makes them nervous. You should ask more questions. You don't, because the number he mentions for 3 weeks of work is more than you'd make in 4 months at your last job, and because 6 weeks of unemployment does something to a person's willingness to interrogate a good opportunity too closely. You sign it on the hood of your car. The work itself starts 2 days later, remotely, through a laptop he couriers to your apartment, pre-configured, no personal accounts allowed on it, a specific VPN client already installed. You're given access to a code base for a financial technology platform, something that processes international wire transfers for what the documentation describes only as institutional clients. The code is good, clean, well architected, the work of serious engineers, not amateurs. Your job is straightforward. Identify vulnerabilities, document them, submit findings through an anonymized portal, get paid on a schedule that arrives exactly on time, every time via a payment processor you've never heard of that somehow clears instantly. The first week is almost boring in its normalcy. You find a handful of minor issues, standard stuff, nothing dramatic. You start to relax into the rhythm of it, the specific pleasure of good, well-paid technical work with no office politics attached. Then, on day 9, you find something that isn't minor. Buried 3 layers deep in the transaction routing logic, there's a function that doesn't match the rest of the codebase's quality. It's sloppy in a way that feels almost deliberate, like someone wanted it to look like an accident. It reroutes a small percentage of international transfers, ones above a certain threshold, through an intermediary account before completing the transfer, adding a delay of exactly 41 seconds, 41 seconds isn't long enough to trigger fraud alerts on most banking systems. It's long enough, you realize after an hour of tracing the logic, to allow someone watching the intermediary account to flag, copy, and act on transaction details before the transfer completes. It's not a bug, it's a surveillance mechanism built into a system that handles what the documentation calls institutional wire transfers. And you sit with your laptop at 2 a.m. understanding, slowly, exactly what kind of institution needs to secretly monitor its own transfers above a certain threshold in a way that survives internal audits because it looks, on the surface, exactly like a bug. You think about the NDA clause. Don't investigate the ownership structure. Don't ask who's actually paying for this. You understand now why that clause exists, and you understand that you were never supposed to find this particular function, because a competent auditor who wasn't specifically told to skip Section 14 of the codebase would have found it eventually, and someone clearly assumed you'd stop looking before you got there. You didn't stop looking. That was your first mistake, or your first act of integrity, depending on which version of the story you tell yourself later. You document it anyway, because the anonymized portal is designed to receive exactly this kind of finding. And some part of you, the part that still believes in doing the job correctly regardless of who's watching, submits the report the way you'd submit any other vulnerability. Dorian calls you directly the next morning. He's never called you directly before. Everything before this has gone through the portal. Automated, distant, deliberately impersonal. You need to delete that finding, he says. No greeting, no pleasantry. You ask why, since finding vulnerabilities is literally the job you're being paid for. Because you weren't supposed to get that deep into the rooting logic, he says. That's not a vulnerability. That's not something we're asking you to fix. I need you to understand the difference between what you were hired to find and what you happened to stumble into. You ask him directly what the function actually does, since he clearly already knows. There's a long pause, long enough that you hear him decide something on the other end of the line. It's a compliance mechanism, he says finally, for a client who needs visibility into large transfers before they clear, for reasons that are legal, regulated, and none of your concern. You need to delete the finding, sign an additional confidentiality addendum specific to this discovery, and receive a bonus payment for your trouble. Or you don't do any of that, and we terminate the contract today, and you walk away with what you've already earned and nothing more. You ask what happens if you just tell someone, a journalist, a regulator, anyone. Then you've broken the NDA you signed on the hood of your car 4 days after we met, he says. And you'll spend the next several years of your life and most of your remaining savings defending yourself in a jurisdiction specifically chosen because their courts move slowly and their damages caps are generous to plaintiffs like us. You'll win eventually, maybe. It'll cost you everything to get there. You take the bonus. You delete the finding. You tell yourself this is the smart choice, the only choice. That whatever this actually is, it's bigger than you, and your job was never to be a whistleblower, just an auditor, and auditors find things and sometimes get told those things aren't their problem. The contract ends on schedule, 3 weeks total, exactly as promised. You're paid the full amount plus the bonus, and Dorian disappears from your life as cleanly as he entered it. No further contact, no explanation, nothing. For 8 months, you don't think about it much. You get a new job, a real one, at a company with an actual office and an actual legal department, and the parking garage feels like something that happened to a different, more desperate version of you. Then you see the headline. A mid-sized European bank collapses overnight, not from a market crash, but from what regulators are calling systemic transaction fraud spanning 18 months. A scheme where large international transfers were being intercepted and partially redirected through shell accounts before final settlement. always delayed by less than a minute, always beneath the threshold that would trigger automatic review. Investigators describe it as one of the most sophisticated financial surveillance and skimming operations uncovered in a decade, embedded so deeply in the transaction architecture that it survived 3 separate compliance audits before finally being caught. You read the technical description of the mechanism in the financial press, and your hands go cold because it's your 41 seconds. It's the function you found and were paid to bury. You spend a full day convincing yourself it's a coincidence, a similar mechanism independently discovered elsewhere, because surely the world doesn't work in a way where you personally found this exact scheme 8 months before it became international news and then got paid to make sure nobody else found it either. Then you see the name of the platform being investigated. It's not the exact company you audited. It's a subsidiary of the parent company that owned the platform you audited. A detail buried 3 paragraphs into a financial trade publication that almost nobody outside the industry would think to check. You spend that night doing something you should have done 8 months earlier and didn't, because an NDA and a bonus payment convinced you it wasn't your business. You research Dorian's name, the payment processor that paid you, anything you can find. Most of it dead ends. Shell companies wrapped in shell companies. The kind of corporate architecture designed specifically to survive exactly this sort of curiosity. But one thing doesn't dead end. The anonymized portal where you submitted your findings still exists. You still have the login, and when you check it out of a compulsion you can't fully explain to yourself, you find that your original submission, the one describing the 41-second routing function, is still there in your submission history. It was never deleted. You were told it was deleted. You watched, or believed you watched, an automated confirmation that the finding was removed from the system. But it's sitting right there, time-stamped, exactly as you originally wrote it. You sit with your laptop at 1 a.m., understanding, slowly, the actual shape of what happened to you. Dorian didn't need you to delete the finding. He needed you to believe you deleted it, to feel complicit enough in the cover-up that you'd never come forward voluntarily, while the actual documentation, proof that someone at the parent company knew about the mechanism 8 months before regulators caught it, sat quietly preserved in a system you still had access to. You were never the auditor who found a problem and was paid to look away. You were the paper trail, the insurance policy, the person whose technical report, preserved and time-stamped, would eventually prove that the parent company had knowledge of the scheme long before it collapsed, that they had the opportunity to stop it and chose the money instead, and that when regulators eventually needed to establish exactly how long the fraud had been known and tolerated, there'd be a detailed, credentialed, technical document sitting in a database with your name on it and a date 8 months before the scandal broke. They didn't silence you. They preserved you, kept your finding intact, dated and ready, the exact evidence needed to establish willful negligence rather than mere incompetence, evidence that could be produced at precisely the moment it would be most useful to someone, though you still don't know to whom or why or what happens now that regulators are already circling, and a documented, dated, technically precise account of the exact mechanism sits waiting in a system that was never actually cleared, in an account that's still, somehow, active under your name. Your phone buzzes. Unknown number. You already know, before you even look, that it's going to be Dorian. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story.